In this episode, we'll take a look at the Audio Technica AT875R. It's a budget short shotgun microphone. Now, first of all, the AT875R is a small, short shotgun microphone, very small, very light. And it was originally designed, it looks like, for mounting it on a professional camcorder or something with an XLR input. It does have an XLR output, so it's not really made to go directly into a hybrid camera or a mirrorless camera or even a DSLR camera. So to get this started, let's go ahead and give you some audio samples that have not been processed at all.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. Now, like most shotgun and boom microphones, this does have a directional polar pattern. They call it a line gradient, which is another term that's often used for the specific directionality that they're aiming for here, of course, to get the sound that you want and reject the sound that you don't want. In this case, it turns out in practical terms, it's very much like a supercardioid polar pattern, which I think more of you have probably heard of. Here's a demonstration of how that works. And here comes the car. So it's off to my left. And again, the microphone is aimed down at me in a typical boom position, so you get a sense for how well it does at rejecting. Okay. Got another car coming, so I'm booming this from above. And again, typical position, 40 centimeters. And here comes a car right now, just so you can see how well it works in terms of rejecting sound. Now I can also turn this way and use the polar pattern of my microphone. That cut down on the sound quite a bit. Okay, so right now I'm perfectly on axis, talking straight into the microphone, and I'm going to start turning it off axis some. So now we're at 90 degrees off axis, and I'm going to keep going here, and now we are 180 degrees off axis. And now we're going to come back to 90 degrees off axis and then back on axis at 100 or at 0 degrees. So the idea here is to see how the timbre of my voice changed as we turned the microphone, because the polar pattern basically changes, or is different, I should say. It doesn't change, it's different at different frequencies. So that's a kind of a feature of shotgun microphones, for better or worse, generally worse. So what that means is the off-axis sounds can start to sound kind of otherworldly. They don't sound really natural. They have kind of a different timbre to them than when they're on axis. So, for example, if you're standing next to a bunch of traffic, the traffic can start to sound really super whooshy, as opposed to like normal traffic would sound. The off-axis rejection and the coloration that you get when you're off-axis from this microphone, pretty typical of microphones in this price range, I would say. I think you're starting to see some of the more expensive professional grade shotgun microphones put a lot more engineering into getting a more even, more natural sounding off-axis response, just so that the sounds that are around you that will inevitably be picked up by any microphone sound like real life. And so while they're attenuated to a large extent, they do sound a little bit more natural. On this particular microphone, there's some coloration there. It did sound pretty muffled. We were still picking up some of the lower frequencies there, where it seemed to cut off a lot of the higher frequencies. But overall, I think it's very much in line with what I would expect for a microphone of this price. We did do a practical noise floor sample here, and we used our traditional method that I use here. It's a very practical test. Really what we're doing is we're recording silence in a room, also recording dialogue in that same exact recording. I loudness normalize the dialogue to -23 LUFS. So I get it to a very standardized kind of loudness level. Then I measure the silent portion. And in this case, what we found is that it came out to -68 dB RMS max. That's actually surprisingly good for a microphone in this price range. And I guess I haven't mentioned that yet. The price is $169 US at the time of this review. Handling noise is another consideration when you're talking about a boom microphone. Again, I don't use this microphone on top of a camera. I always put it on a boom. In fact, in this case here, we're recording this entire episode with the AT875R into my Sound Devices 888, and it's on a boom pole, boomed out of the frame just right here in front of me. So it's probably 35 centimeters from my mouth. Now, if you are going to operate that boom pole manually, actually hold the boom pole and cue it back and forth between people saying things, their lines of dialogue, for example, then you are going to need a shock mount. That's typical of any boom microphone. You can't just use the stand clip that comes with it because the vibrations that are going to be picked up by the pole will transfer to the microphone as well, and they'll kind of just make a mess. Nothing unusual here. All boom microphones need shock mounts when it comes down to it. How did the AT875 do? It did well. It did well for its price range, certainly. It is not the very best I've ever used, but it certainly isn't the worst either. If you use a good shock mount, you're in good hands. Like other condenser microphones, this does require phantom power. However, it's fairly flexible. You can supply anywhere between 11 and 48 volts, and that'll power this. So if you have something that only supplies 12 volts, then you're good. Overall, the microphone includes a stand clip. So if you want to statically boom this onto a static boom microphone stand, you can do that. It also comes with a 5/8 to 3/8 inch adapter, so you can work with pretty much any microphone stand out there. Also comes with these O-rings for mounting to a pro-level camcorder. So this is going to just give it a little bit more of a tight fit inside that little harness on the camcorder. It also comes with a foam cover and this storage pouch. As I mentioned, it comes in at $169 US at the time of this review, and it does also come with a 5-year warranty, which is great. I've always had good luck with my Audio-Technica microphones. Big fan of the AT4053B. Now, no microphone is perfect, especially when you're talking about microphones at this price point, but this one does seem to stand out to a lot of the other microphones I've looked at, certainly in this price range. In terms of its overall audio quality, it just seemed really quite good to me. The one thing I do notice is that on sibilant voices like my own, the S's and the C's, it doesn't handle them super well. Like it didn't handle them as well as some of the other microphones that I've used that are obviously much more expensive. So again, I don't think it's a major problem. You may have to use a de-esser in post, or if you're live streaming with this, maybe just apply a little de-essing if you do have a sibilant voice. If not, you're fine. Another thing that is not really a con, but just something to know, is that the directionality of this microphone is not as focused as something like a classic MKH416 from Sennheiser. So you're going to pick up a little bit more of the ambiance around it, but I still think it's very, very usable. I'm really impressed that for $169 US, you can get something of this quality. So overall, this microphone just works really, really well. I don't know what else to say about it, except that if I were on a tighter budget and I needed an XLR microphone, I would not hesitate to recommend this one here. You can be the judge of the audio quality based on the samples we gave you earlier. Hope that was helpful for you. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. And if you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that, and we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.